back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the onset of the Great Depression and its early years. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about a few of the worst episodes of the Depression as it sank to its worst depths in 1932. In particular, the March of the Bonus Army. In the previous lecture, we talked about the stock market crash and the worsening depression in the late 1920s and heading into the 1930s. And contrary to the reassuring messages of President Herbert Hoover, things didn't get better on their own. In fact, they continued to slide from 1929 to 1930, 31 until they finally bottomed out in 1932, which was the worst year of the Great Depression and one of the worst years in our nation's history. We're going to be talking quite a bit about how factors were in the country in that year of 1932. And we're also going to talk about a couple of the worst episodes of the Great Depression itself. By 1932, things were bad pretty much all over the country. Unemployment was well over 20% nationally and much higher than that in certain parts of the country. Poverty was on the rise and farmers were as bad off as ever. One of the episodes that occurred in 1932, which symbolizes how bad things had gotten, was the creation of the Farmers' Holiday Association. This was done by a group of farmers led by a man named Milo Reno. Now, Reno and others identified part of the issue as the Depression was setting in was overproduction, as we've discussed. Farmers were growing products and producing livestock and milk and things like this at record numbers. The problem was too much product reaching the market and prices were too low. And so Reno and this Farmers' Holiday Association proposed that farmers stop growing, stop producing. This is the so-called holiday. They take a holiday. That in and of itself wasn't so bad. The thought was if we can decrease the amount of product reaching the market, that prices will start to come up. But they also engaged in some instances of what we would describe today as industrial sabotage. Things like stopping milk trucks and dumping out the contents over the road. There were a few instances of sabotaging railroads which were bringing product toward the market. So in hindsight, this becomes really just kind of a sad example and testament to how bad and desperate things had gotten. Do we really think that dumping over a couple of milk trucks or egg trucks is going to correct the market? But I'll add as a final footnote here that the thinking behind the Farmers' Holiday Association was not all wrong. Milo Reno's main objective was to decrease the amount of product reaching the market, which would stabilize prices. As we're going to see, FDR, as part of the New Deal when he becomes president, implements some very similar policies, but on a much broader scale, on a national scale, and they're actually more effective. So we shouldn't look back completely with disdain on Milo Reno and his efforts, because the thinking behind it wasn't really all that misguided. Even more infamous and powerfully symbolic of how bad things had gotten by 1932 was the so-called March of the Bonus Army. So a little bit of background here. In 1924, the federal government had passed the Adjusted Compensation Act, which would pay a bonus to veterans of World War I. And some of you might recall, we talked about this in some earlier lectures. In the aftermath of World War I, should World War I veterans get any kind of compensation? Well, finally in 1924, Congress passes this act. As one catch, though, they weren't going to get those bonuses right away. They were going to have to wait to receive them until 1945, which would give the federal government time to put the funding together. Well, that was all well and good in the middle of the 1920s, and a few years after that, the midst of the roaring 20s, most of these veterans were doing okay. But with the onset of the Great Depression, though, many of the veterans became in dire need of money now, and they began to demand their bonuses immediately. Gradually, Hundreds of veterans and eventually thousands of them traveled to Washington, D.C. to make a claim in person for those veterans and their benefits that were due to them. By the summer of 1932, some 25,000 veterans were encamped in the city. Some were living in abandoned warehouses in the city, while others camped across the Anacostia River in a field known as Anacostia Flats. This encampment, by the way, came to be one of the most infamous of what were known as Hoovervilles, just conglomerations of huts and lean-tos and shacks that were built for homeless people and impoverished people. And all across the country, these kind of places came to be called Hoovervilles. And really just about anything negative during that time took on the negative connotation with the nickname of Hoover something. So, for instance, empty pockets that were turned inside out came to be called Hoover flags, and so on. So the veterans camped out at Anacostia Flats, and while they remained peaceful, they were an eyesore and an embarrassment, particularly to President Hoover. Hoover himself was indecisive, finally electing to literally lock himself in the White House to avoid confrontation with the veterans. The active army itself was torn. These were, after all, veterans they were dealing with. Their bedraggled camps were filled with tattered American flags, and many of the marchers wore their army fatigues. Douglas MacArthur, the nation's only four-star general and ranking general, promised leaders of the march that he would give them good warning if they needed to get out, although he himself personally opposed the march. But another general, George Moseley, wanted to arrest the marchers and lock them in concentration camps. By July 28th, Hoover and MacArthur had decided to remove the marcher at least from the abandoned buildings in Washington, D.C. itself. While the removal began peacefully, hundreds of marchers at Anacostia heard about it and rushed to defend their comrades. In the conflict which resulted, 4 veterans were killed. MacArthur was incensed. He decided to treat the removal as an active military maneuver. "There is incipient revolution in the air," he said. He called in the cavalry, machine guns, and tanks. The veterans assembled in front of the warehouses to watch what they assumed was a parade in their honor. They were stunned when the troops turned on them. The army fired gas grenades into the crowd and drove them across the Anacostia River, where the bulk of the bonus army awaited. Hoover had ordered MacArthur not to cross the river, but he disobeyed. He led the army into Anacostia Flats, a jumble of lean-tos, chicken crates, and boxes. The army led with tear gas, flushing the marchers out of their makeshift homes. Several children were killed in the ensuing conflict, and a few who were too slow to retreat were stabbed with bayonets. The soldiers then set the camp ablaze. The only possessions the destitute marchers had were burned. A young major named Dwight Eisenhower commented, "The whole scene was pitiful. The veterans, whether or not they were mistaken in marching on Washington, were ragged, ill-fed, and felt themselves badly abused. To suddenly see the whole encampment going up in flames just added to the pity one had to feel for them." The marchers retreated from Washington. They were shunned like lepers in each state, shuttled by train or along dusty roads, out of Maryland, out of Virginia, out of Ohio and Missouri, until finally they mingled anonymously with the millions of other homeless wanderers who clustered along American roadsides in 1932. The March of the Bonus Army and its destruction by the government marks one of the low points in the lowest period of the Great Depression. Certainly, it demonstrated that Hoover was not the man to handle the job. As we've mentioned and we'll talk much more about in future lectures, the man who would be elected that fall was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he entered the White House in March of 1933, determined to change things. But the March of the Bonus Army the previous summer, in 1932, might have been the tipping point that sealed the fate of Hoover as the election that year loomed.